computer. All right, hi there. I am Heather Goddess Moore. I am a provisional deacon in the North Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church, and I am here today with
Brian Plant.
And we're going to talk today about neurodiversity and how it looks and feels in the world, and how it looks and feels in the church. So Brian, will you kind of give a definition of sorts of what we're talking about today?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to talk about neurodiversity, but I think one of the most straightforward ways is to think about it as there are different ways that our brains are wired. And in the population, there could be a variety of different ways that people are wired. You could consider it like a spectrum, but there are also fairly distinct ways that particular people are wired. Folks that are on the autism spectrum, for example, ADHD, bipolar, folks who have cognitive or sensory disorders, folks who have traumatic brain injuries, basically anything that might affect the way that your brain is connected to itself and how that shows up in relationships, how that shows up in your sensory processing of the world, how it shows up in your emotional processing of the world, and in your self-concept. And so I think this is a really vibrant and vital topic because as we're learning more about the human brain and how that affects how we relate, there are more insights that people are having that, maybe I don't operate quite that way, or maybe this diagnosis or this way of thinking about how my brain works explains a lot about my experience and why certain things have been difficult for me, or why I might have unique giftedness in certain areas. So there's certainly more we could say about that, but that's a general overview of how I think about neurodiversity anyway.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think that I love how you said, people kind of come to understand their own neurodiversity when they're like, oh, that's why that happens, or that's why I do that way, or whatever, because that was what it was for me. So how I come into this conversation is through, I grew up in Calapac in the conference there, and I know George Hooper, and I know Bob Rhodes, and I know a lot of the pastors out there because they were all people that I grew up with. And I'm a part of the Calapac camping system. I do camp down at Camp Cedar Glen in the summer, and we work with kids who sometimes come to camp and are neurodiverse, and it's something that's just more and more prominent in those places. And as a person who identifies as neurodiverse as well, my experience has brought me to that table and having those conversations of how can we make camp more accessible to all types of brains, right? All types of people. And so I'm really excited to have the conversation because I was one of those that was not diagnosed until my son was diagnosed. And then it was like a light went off and was like, oh, that's why I need to make lists all the time. And that's why I live and die by my calendar. And that's why I need to listen to a book and read it at the same time. I can't just read it. Or it takes me like 5 years to read a book. So I'm excited about it because I think it is a very relevant conversation in all of the places that we are in relationship, whether it be at home or at work or at church. And so I think it's really great that George and Upside Down Church are having this conversation tonight.
Yeah, and just if you're willing to share for some of our listeners, kind of where would you say you fall on in the neurodiverse landscape?
I skipped that whole part. That's the ADHD right there. Yeah, so I am ADD, ADHD. The definitions and how the spectrum or glob of diagnoses is categorized changes, but I'm definitely ADD. I struggle with processing memory, so like lists I have to write things down. I can't trust that my brain will remember the list of things I have. Everything is always written down, and I get distracted really easily, which is why like listening to a book and reading a book at the same time keeps me from reading something, which then sends me on a tangent in this direction. My eyes keep moving on the page, but I'm not actually retaining any information because I'm over here thinking about how the cat box needs to be changed. So so that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah.
So what brought you to this conversation, Brian?
Yeah, so my journey's been kind of interesting because I think from a very young age, I kind of always felt a little bit different. Like I just didn't really understand why certain people cared about the things that they cared about. Or, I didn't always, feel like I was getting everything that was going on socially. Like it wasn't obvious to me. There was just a sense of like, I don't feel like I'm making this work, but I always did well in school and all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't until like I got to like college that I started to really investigate anxiety, because I've had anxiety my whole life. And I started to realize just how much anxiety was affecting me and how that was showing up socially, how that was showing up as being kind of, what many people refer to as a highly sensitive person. I really kind of latched onto that label of being just having more sensory and emotional sensitivities and needs around that. And I had some interests that I was like really, really interested in, and not everybody around me was as interested in it as me. And I just kind of had this working model around personal growth, and I'm just sensitive, and I'm just, kind of a deep thinker, and, I have anxiety. And that was just kind of what I had until I met a spiritual director when I was in medical school, about age 25, 26. And she was like, I think you might be on the autism spectrum. And it was kind of came about a year or two after a friend of mine got diagnosed as an adult. And she was like, yeah, I have issues with communication. That's how they diagnosed me. And I said, what, Lauren? Like, I love how you communicate. You're so direct. And like, I always feel like we totally understand each other. And she's like, yeah, because you're probably on the spectrum. And I just like, that I just like wasn't ready to really entertain that more than like a few seconds. And it's not like I got defensive. I was just kind of like, okay, well, maybe, but like, okay, moving on. Because I think a lot of folks don't really understand just how much of a spectrum autism actually is.
Right.
And I think we have this idea in our head based on what we've seen in the media. And by we, I mean neurotypicals, but also we collectively, even autistic people,
Right.
Or neurodivergent people, non-autistic neurodivergent people. And so, but it's not a linear spectrum where on the one end you have like barely autistic, and on the other end, severely autistic, or like, we might say high functioning or
Right.
low functioning, which is, a little bit of an ableist way of thinking about it. It's more like lower support needs, a little bit more autonomous in neurotypical society. And on the other end, you have, high support needs, very difficult time functioning according to certain neurotypical standards of how, you're supposed to live. And so I'm talking a little bit about me, a little bit about the larger conversation. But I think for me, it was a several year process of being like, wait a minute, could I be autistic? What does that mean? What does that mean both personally, and what does it mean about what autism is and how I've been taught to think about autism? And then how I am judging and being hard on myself if it's true that I'm on the autism spectrum, and like just the layers there. And so eventually I did see somebody, did a psychological evaluation. It was great. It was very thorough. They talked to my family, they talked to my mentor, and I got a diagnosis about 4 or 5 months ago.
Wow.
And at first it was incredibly validating. It was like, oh, wow, this explains so much. And then now, if I'm honest, right now I'm kind of in it like, oh, now what?
Right.
Like, this explains why things are so hard. And before, I felt like I had this fire pushing me to overcome my anxiety. And now it's like, oh, I'm just wired differently. So I think this conversation is at an interesting time, because I think this is a very typical journey for adults who have been masked. And we'll talk a little bit about masking and camouflaging and what that means. masked autistic adults who get diagnosed later who then have this kind of like identity crisis. So anyway, I hope that's not too rambly, but
yeah, no, that was great. So you said a couple things that I think might be nice for us to sort of unpack a little bit for the folks that are watching. So you talked a little bit about the ableist language of high functioning and low functioning. And I think it's important that we talk about, especially when we're talking about the autism spectrum, if that's what we want to use the spectrum as that it's not a linear spectrum, but more of kind of a blob or
different color tones, different traits with different volume knobs.
That and often autism has been represented as puzzle pieces, and like there are pieces missing, and they're like all these things, and all of those things are very ableist, kind of putting able-minded in this situation, able-minded persons or neurotypical persons as the norm, and putting anyone who's not that in an outside marginalized space. And so they've sort of done away with this language of high functioning and low functioning, and now use just number system. So it's like ASD level 1 is what used to be called high functioning, or was labeled as Asperger's syndrome. Now it's just ASD level 1. And it goes all the way to, I don't even know what the levels are, to those who would be nonverbal or need the highest, like you were talking about, levels of care. And what this does is this takes it away from, like you were talking about, the neurotypical standards of neurotypical is normal. Neurotypical is what we're trying to achieve, right? And it takes us away from that and makes it to that everybody is on their own playing field, and that that being wired differently doesn't have a value to it, isn't good or bad, it's just different. And I think that that's really important stuff for us to be thinking about as we're thinking about how does neurodiversity look in our communities, and how do we respond in our communities, in our work, in our church, in our families. So my son was diagnosed with ADHD, anxiety, and depression at a pretty young age. It was very obvious very early. He has also been tested several times to see if he is on the spectrum, and every time, not quite. He's adjacent, they always say. So, there are a lot of things that we do that sort of are ways to support him, as presuming that there is some masking that's happening, as you were saying. And the masking thing, I think, is a really interesting conversation, because I have recently, in the last few years, really been looking at, like, what are the ways, I've always called them coping mechanisms, like, what coping mechanisms do I have in order to be able to participate in community as if a neurotypical person, right? So like my list making and taking notes everywhere, and having the ability to, like, come into a space and have a notebook, so I can be drawing, I can be doodling while something's happening, so that I can keep my attention on what's happening and not be distracted. Or making sure that I, am using my calendar and using my notebook for lists and things like that. I'm wondering if you might share some of the ways that you have found that you've masked in order to sort of present as neurotypical.
Yeah, so I masked /mask quite a bit. So I'm a doctor, a naturopathic doctor. I work with a lot of people. I talk a lot. It's a fairly extroverted profession for somebody with my neural landscape. And I'm 3 years into practicing, and I'm realizing that. So I'm pretty new at this. I've been a student for most of my life. And if you're autistic and you're a student, that's great. Well, I shouldn't say that. There are folks who have different support needs and things related to that, but that just so happened to be something that my brain was particularly good at. And the things that have been particularly challenging about the work that I do have been more social and sensory. Like being in an office and there's particular culture with the office, there's lighting that I don't always have control over because it's, not my building and things like that. And so how I mask, I think I put an extraordinary amount of energy in terms of into how I manicure my body language when I'm at a marketing event, for example. A lot of people in my personal life are either on the spectrum or have ADHD. So I seem to have, drawn connected to people or they're neurotypical, but they share my interests. And so we can just talk about the things that we're really interested in, and then we're focused less on how we present ourselves. But yeah, masking or camouflaging is another term for it. It's how do we basically hide our disability? How do we present ourselves in a way that doesn't make it look like we are having a difficulty with functioning in that particular environment? And I think the emphasis on the environment is so key, because I think when we think about disability, a lot of times our assumption is that disability is innate to the individual, right? It's I'm not able, or that person's not able to do something, and less about what types of environments might be enabling or disabling. And so, the social model of disability draws attention to the fact that in a particular environment, somebody might do very well. And in another environment, they might really struggle. And so how do we find and create together, right, community spaces that are healthy environments for folks of various neurotypes? So that you can feel comfortable and safe, and then also not, get overwhelmed. Or if you do get overwhelmed, how do we, support you in that?
I love this. I really love and appreciate what you were just saying about environment, because, I think there are a lot of people who would argue that all this neurodiversity stuff is new, right? That ADHD and autism never used to exist. Now all of a sudden it's everywhere. ADHD never used to exist, and all of a sudden it's everywhere. And I think what is so important is about talking about environments and how it's existing and participating in an environment that makes those differences more pronounced or more noticeable. And I think that if we think about, in many cases, the way that our school system is structured is not, it's meant for a certain type of processing, brain processing, and not other types. And somebody like yourself, somebody like my step kiddo, can blow through school really well, because they are academically wired. They're able to absorb information really quickly and learn and love to absorb more and more information. And then they move on to the next thing and they absorb, and they move on to the next thing and they absorb. Where somebody at a different level of ASD might struggle more, or somebody with ADD or ADHD is going to struggle with distraction, or like something for me as a teenager, and even for my son now, who is a teenager, right? Like following through with assignments. I can't tell you how many times my parents found assignments that I had done crinkled up in the bottom of my backpack and I never turned in. I still, to this day, am finding things in my son's backpack that are crinkled up in the bottom of his backpack that he's done that he never turned in, right? And so I was pretty much a B and C student because of those things, and that's the same thing that that Noah struggles with now. But that's really about the fact that he'll get A's and B's on tests, but because he's not turning in homework, he's getting C's, right? And so it's something about the environment of how schools are structured and work is structured and church is structured that make it difficult to have those social interactions. And so I think that's a big piece of why we're having this conversation today, is sort of talk about what are the challenges in the spaces that neurotypical and neurodiverse people are together, and also what are the things that we see that are gifts that are the rose, so to speak, when we're talking about the good and the bad. So from a relationship standpoint, whether it be in familial relationships or work relationships, what would you say are some challenges or gifts that you think are brought to the table
among neurodivergent
yeah
people? Yeah. So I think it's also really important, that question of mine kind of brings up a really important component of this, which folks say this a lot about autism, but I think it more generally applies to anybody that's not neurotypical or that is neurodiverse or neurodivergent, which is that when you've met one neurodivergent or you've met one autistic person, you've met one neurodivergent or one autistic person. There's so much variability just built into it, and that can be a little bit disorienting, I think, in the conversation, and disorienting particularly when we're talking to neurotypicals about, okay, well, what is this? It's like, well, wait a minute. I'm trying to get an idea of, like, I'm trying to type people so that I can understand what it is that they need or whatever. And the challenge is that's like it's kind of like built into the programming that's not how this works, and that's why it's so important. Certain folks have said, nothing, and this has probably been present in other communities as well, but nothing about us without us, where it's like, really asking each individual kind of neurodivergent person in a community kind of like, well, what are your unique, needs or gifts or, what have you, and kind of how do we support that? And so from my perspective, but it's certainly not entirely representative, I'd say neurodivergent folks can sometimes have difficulty noticing nonverbal information. So subtle things in terms of body language, tone, implications, certain social rules don't always come intuitively to us. Many of us have had to learn the rules, usually the hard way. Like they've maybe responded in a social situation that wasn't considered appropriate from a neurotypical point of view, and there's been consequences to that, like judgment or rejection or things like that. But I think a lot of folks who have learned to mask have had to learn, like, you break down the mechanics of how do you relate rather than it being something that's intuitive. And as you can imagine, that takes an exhaustible amount of energy. Making eye contact is tricky. There are folks on the spectrum who have a hard time who find eye contact very uncomfortable. And there are other folks on the spectrum who make really penetrating eye contact. It's actually quite interesting. So I would say from a social relational standpoint, it's the picking up on cues, the trying to not the eye contact, for me, the hypervigilance of how I come across. Right? Do I sound interested enough? Do I sound warm enough? I mean, if I'm totally honest, I think because I've been masking all day, I'm masking to some extent now. And I think you kind of have to go through this, like, I don't want to say detox period, but it's sort of like, okay, well, if I were to take off the mask right now, like, I think I'd be making less eye contact. I'm going to be talking a little bit more slowly. My tone's a little bit more neutral. And I think it's hard to relate. In fact, there was some interesting research that was done that showed if you took two neurotypical people, or if you took a group of neurotypical people that played telephone, that game where one person says something and they pass it down, and you took a group of, it was either autistic people or just neurodivergent people, and do it, both groups perform the same. But when you mix the group, that's when there were issues. And what do we mean by issues? Miscommunications, feelings getting hurt,
right?
Those kinds of things. And so it's kind of a long-winded answer to the question, but I think the short answer is there's a lot. I mean, there's the sensory, there's the, how do we read and interpret, and then how do we respond, and, like, to me, social communication takes an enormous amount of energy, more than solving a complex philosophical problem about the nature of reality.
I really appreciate your vulnerability and kind of sharing what taking that mask off looks like and sounds like. Because I think that from an organizational standpoint, as a church leader, as someone who works with youth and young adults and has to create environments for people, I think that it's really important for us to kind of recognize that everything that we do is always planned from a neurotypical standpoint, because that's how our culture is created. So like, if I just use youth ministry as an example, like, or actually I'll use camp as an example, because that's the most recent, and that's how I got asked to come into this conversation was the conversations that Bob and I had around camp and some of the experiences that we had as a whole camp. I have been going to camp since I was 11 years old. I'm not going to let you do the math. It's not a big deal, right? But it's a long time. And camp has always been a certain way, right? Like camp is loud, camp is dirty, camp is jam-packed all day stuff. And you know, it's outside and it's hot and you're sleeping in a weird place, and it's, you know, there's so much about camp, and it's been this way for so long, right? And that's the way that it's always been structured. And what we've seen over the last several years is as our social understanding of neurodiversity grows and expands, the more the typical way of doing camp doesn't work. We can't have a whole group gathering in a small room with no windows where everyone is yelling and clapping and being really loud, because folks, especially on the autism spectrum, who have sensory issues, especially around sound, cannot be in that environment. And it not only is dysregulating to them emotionally, but like they will have physical reactions that, and as Christians, as clergy, as camp staff, as whatever, I mean, whatever your leadership role is, like that immediately makes that environment not affirming, not inclusive, not, you know, like all the things. And so as we look at like, okay, well, and how do we create environments that can allow for neurodiversity to not only feel included and affirmed, but be able to flourish and learn and experience something that is transformative in the same way for a neurotypical person that camp could be transformative. And so we look at things like, let's talk to some key campers, and instead of clapping, we're going to snap, right? Like let's say we're going to move campfire a little bit so that if there are folks that need to go to bed because they need a full 10 hours of sleep or whatever, you know, like whatever their need is, they can make the choice to go to bed, and they're not missing out on a really important and emotion, you know, like fun experience, like campfire. So I think for us, and again, like I would consider myself neurodiverse, but I am not on the spectrum, and I don't deal with the same things that I have to juggle. And so as a church leader, I'm constantly thinking like, oh, this is going to be too loud, or this space is. So one of the things we did at one point in time during the week of camp was we were meeting up in the chapel that's up on the hill. It's a pretty small room. The windows are like little tiny windows up at the top of the wall. And the kids, the neurodiverse kids, were all sitting outside the door. And only one door would open. And so they could only kind of see in, and they couldn't really participate. And I finally was like, hey, let's move down the hill to the bigger room that has windows along the whole side of the building. They can sit outside of the building. They can see in. They'll be able to fully be a part of what's happening, but they're not surrounded by the noise and the sound and the people. And it was a good move. I mean, it was something that really ended up being a positive thing for the whole camp. And I think those are the types of things that as a church, we have to start thinking about. And at work, we have to start thinking about. And my full-time job is at Southern Methodist University, and I work at the seminary there, and I do adult education, continuing ed, things like that. And our events, we're constantly looking at it saying, okay, well, we look at diversity of race and gender and sexuality and all these other things. We're like, but we need to be thinking about how do we remain inclusive and diverse around neurodiversity and neurotypical folks. And so it's a constant thing. And like we were talking about earlier, the language is constantly changing, right? So the landscape is constantly changing, and we're always having to sort of see how we can and we're always having to learn more and continue to broaden our understanding of what it means to be in ministry, what it means to be in relationship, what it means to be in community in an inclusive way.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting when we're thinking about inclusivity specifically from a neurodiversity perspective is that we're talking about the way that we're talking about our brains, we're talking about our instruments of experience, which means the content and the presentation and the setting of whatever it is that you're doing is like all of that is filtered through your sensory and your social and your emotional processing systems. Not that it's not playing a role in other diverse communities or certain intersectional domains here, but it's very interesting to think about it like that. It's like, well, how do we create an inclusive environment? Well, I don't want to speak for other neurodivergent folks, but like I don't care a ton what the language is as much as I care what my sensory and social experience gets to be. And how I can feel not safe, and I know others as well can feel not safe if they're like, this is the only way to do this experience. This is the only way to have this content delivered to you. It's going to be delivered, and there's going to be bright lights, there's going to be loud noises, it's going to be extroverted activity, and it's like, oh, okay, well, I don't feel safe because I'm in fight or flight. And social bonding, in fact, this is where I can kind of talk like a doctor for a second. Like the way that we form relationships involves particular parts of our brain that are involved in attunement to the people around us. We might call it co-regulation. Other people use the term ventral vagal in the sense that the part of our nervous system that's involved in relaxing is also involved in feeling safe with other people. If you're overstimulated as a neurodivergent person in an environment that might be pleasantly stimulating, like positively stimulating to a neurotypical person, and then that neurodivergent person isn't going to feel safe enough to activate the parts of the nervous system that are involved in actually building relationships. So this isn't just like, ideas. This is like the neuroscience of how we relate and how we form bonds in community, and how a conversation like this is intended just to bring some awareness to that, of like, how do we have more conversations about what types of experiences are actually promote building of relationships, ways that honor preferences of neurotypicals, but also really center or give attention to the needs of neurodivergent people. Because I think where some of the ableism can get the better of us as a community is when preferences and comfort of neurotypicals trumps support needs, emphasis on needs, not preferences, not wants, but
Right. Needs.
in order to feel safe in community and in your own body of neurodivergent people. So just wanted to put that in there.
Yeah, I think that this difference between preferences or luxuries and needs is really key, because as we were, we're in the church, at least, and I think in actually the business world is probably better at it than the church is, to be honest. But we are, as a whole, as a culture, better at accommodating needs of physically differently abled folks, disabled or other, than we are neurodivergent folks, because it's a visible physical thing. And if I'm frank, probably because it's a lot easier to prove an ADA violation to somebody who has a physical disability than somebody who has a neurodivergent disability difference.
Yeah. No, we honestly, if I may, I think that we should call it disability, because I think to minimize that is one, not that I'm saying that you're doing this, but I'm saying I think many of us say, well, don't call it a disability, you have gifted. And it's like, no, it's quite disabling. When I come home from work some days, I just can't do anything.
Yeah.
Because of a particular, so like, yeah, no, they're disabilities in the cultural and sensory kind of milieu, for lack of a better word, that we find ourselves in. Yeah.
Yeah. After or before a year and a half ago, I had never heard the word milieu before. And now, after the year and a half that we've had in our family, like, milieu is like a word we use all the time. So for those of you who don't know what a milieu is, it's basically like a small community, or it's a community of people who are, it might be a group that's in treatment together, or a classroom together, or something like that. Is that a good?
That's interesting, because as a kind of with the science background, I think about it actually quite differently. So that's,
I hear it.
I think about like the biochemical milieu or the physiological milieu as kind of the terrain or the ecosystem.
Oh, I like that.
It's kind of like the system, the dynamic, landscape, I think, is probably the best way that I think about it. Not that I disagree with you, but it's just interesting, but because both actually apply.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think they both, I love this. It's like, to think about it. Because I think you're right. I think that it can be the terrain, because in many cases a community is a terrain, right? Like, it's something you have to navigate. And a map is great. So yeah, I love that. No, but it's just one of those words where I was like, I've never heard this word before, and now I'm using it all the time. But so I know that we're coming up on time for the conversation, so that the group can go and talk about this as a group. And so I'm wondering if there are any sort of, not really final thoughts, but like nuggets or pieces of wisdom, or things that you think are just really important about what the next part of this conversation looks like.
Yeah, I think I've been trying to think about that in the background throughout this whole conversation of like, okay, how do we bring it all together? And just to be personally transparent, like I still have so many questions, both about the way that my own brain works and what healthy relationship and community looks like in my own life, and then the larger conversation where I'm sure there are neurodivergent folks who could answer this question so much better than me. And I want to give voice to that. But at the same time, I think the conversation, when we make space for folks to share genuinely what their needs are, like that could be something as granular as, hey, I'm listening to you, but I just can't make eye contact right now. Or like, I mean, not that you have to even say that, but just maybe if there's misunderstanding, if a neurotypical person's like, I don't know if this person, I can't tell if this person's engaged or not, just curiosity rather than judgment or assumption, because the reality might be that neurodivergent person is actually feeling very deeply, and has thoughts about the experience or cares a lot about the other person, but isn't able to express that in a way that would be recognized by a neurotypical person. So on a one-on-one basis, but then I think on a communal basis, it kind of goes back to like, how do we set the stage for sensory and social engagement that isn't that accounts for the needs of folks who maybe have different sensory thresholds. Or put that more simply, like, ask neurodivergent people in your community, or not even that, but just ask people in your community, how do we feel about this programming? Is there something for you here? Is there something, for other people? I mean, some people have special interests and they can power through their sensory sensitivities because their social challenges because they're really interested on a particular topic.
Right.
But when church, my experience in some of the more recent engagements with evangelical churches is, and this isn't meant to be a generalization, but the evangelical churches I went to, it was like, this was how you do Bible study. It's a very particular way. It's very cerebral. It's very, literal. There's not really much room for artistic interpretation. This is how you do it. And there's a right way to think. And then this is how we do worship. It's loud music, it's lights, it's dark in the Ritz. Everybody has to stand and have a praise experience. And this is how you're supposed to do this. And then you do service and it's supposed to look like this. And there wasn't, for me, it was suffocating. There wasn't room for nerding out on things that are kind of maybe quirky, or having a one-on-one breakfast with somebody and having that be,
right,
a form of worship. So anyway, to be honest, there's no way that I know how to really neatly tie this up. But I think the conversation is around, how do we create a more varied landscape or a more varied milieu that allows neurodivergent people to feel seen, heard, included. And if there's a lack of understanding, it's okay. Like, a lot of neurodivergent people are still trying to figure out their own identity and what this means. So it's okay. We don't expect that neurotypicals will be 100% attuned and aware of what we need when maybe we don't even know what we need, but there at least is an openness and a curiosity to being able to share that.
Yeah, I think, like I had said to you before we started recording, I think that if in these types of conversations, in small groups in churches who are asking hard questions and having discussions, if after the presentation part is over, you have more questions, then we've met our goal. We've met our purpose. I hope that what comes after this is a fruitful conversation that opens more doors and encourages everybody who's watching this to continue to learn about themselves and learn about others, and really celebrate and revel in the diversity and creativity of God. Because that's what neurodiversity shows us, is how absolutely wonderful and amazingly creative God has been in this world and with the people that we interact with every day. And we need to embrace that in the same way that God embraces it. So I hope that your conversation is fruitful, and I know that the leaders of the Upside Down Church have our contact information. So if you have questions or want to talk to us more, we would be glad, I'm sure, to, I'm just going to throw you out there, Brian, be like, Brian will talk to you too via email. There's no masking involved there. I just hope that it's a great night for you all. Thanks for being here.